This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good morning and welcome to the Friday morning break with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this week is Dr. Christian Ilbery from Edinburgh University. We are discussing oracy and accent and how we speak. And should we be teaching students not only to speak precisely and speak well, but speak in a certain way?
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
And welcome back. It's Friday the 29th of November. The term is flying by and Christmas is in sight. The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. How well do you speak? Do you have an accent? A regional accent? A dialect? Did you have one and you determinedly got rid of it? Or are you proud of your accent? And in fact, you like to emphasize it? Well, accent, how we speak, the projection of our voices, and the ability to speak in a certain way is the subject of today's interview with my guest, Dr. Christian Ilbery, who's a lecturer and a sociolinguist at the University of Edinburgh, who's conducted quite a bit of research into the topic of accents, how we judge them, their cultural and social capital, and whether or not there is truth in the concept of being well-spoken or articulate. Are these the same things? Well, that's what we're about to discuss. So, Christian, I just described you as a sociolinguist. Would you like to, tell us what that is?
Yeah, so as a sociolinguist, I'm interested in what language tells us about the social world. So, even as I've just been speaking then, your listeners will be trying to infer things about my social identity. So obviously, on the way that I speak, there's some signifiers that suggest to people that, well, I'm clearly not from Scotland. I'm not from Edinburgh. And depending on the way that I say certain words like water or milk, and that might signal to some of your listeners where I'm from in the UK. And so I'm from London. Also a particular type of Londoner. I'm from a working class background, so my speech is representative of that social identity. So I'm interested in how linguistic information, what that linguistic information tells us about the social world. And because accent cues to things like your region, where you're from in the UK or elsewhere, or for instance, your gender, your sexuality, people often use accent to make inferences about somebody's social identity. And sometimes that's right, sometimes it's wrong. But there are other qualities of an individual, like intelligence, like competence, which do not cue to accent, right? So just because someone speaks in a non-standard or working class accent, it doesn't tell us anything about their potential competence of doing a certain job, right? And so I'm interested in understanding and dismantling some of those ideologies that lead people to make comments about somebody's competence or professionalism on the basis of the way that they speak.
When I was preparing for this interview, Christian, I read some of your work and papers, and one phrase that jumped out for me was standard accent ideology. And it struck me, of course, that is what we're talking about here. It's the way in which accent and judging people's accents in a certain way is related to ideas about how the world is and how the world should be, and ideas of power and privilege and so on. When I was a kid, of course, there was speaking properly, and speaking properly was BBC received pronunciation, and that was the way you aspired to speak. It was demonstrated to you on the television and so on and on the radio by BBC journalists and how you spoke. And also before that, though, it was a fairly brutal colonial attitude towards language, as In the past, the English tried to stamp out not only Welsh language, but Welsh accent, and Irish language, but also Irish accent, and so on. And so today, we are, I guess, trying to get away from the idea that accent is somehow connected to clarity of speaking.
Right. And so our view is, as sociolinguists, why does it really matter if somebody says think or think, right, with a first sound or a third sound? At the end of the day, they're still the same thing, right? And you likely understood what that speaker meant. And some of this variation, all variation is systematic. People don't just come out and start speaking in funny ways or whatever you want to describe it as.
Yes.
People speak in ways because it's conditioned by certain social and linguistic factors. And some of these things relate to, for instance, your ethnic background, your class positionality. And so a comment about somebody's language is also a comment about somebody's identity.
Yes.
So I think we need to be really careful about this idea that some varieties are clearer or perhaps, more expressive. I just don't buy that argument at all.
Yeah. So there's in other words, it's a mask to a real agenda, which is some kind of cultures are valuable and some aren't.
Sexual discriminate on the basis of language or accent. This is not a protected characteristic. And so people often do these judgments about race, ethnicity, sexuality, and so on through the back door. So that's really problematic to me as somebody that's interested in language and social justice.
If we said, many listeners, I think, might well agree with this and say, but what about I'm going to use that term, real world, the world of discrimination and the world of unfair judgment. So someone goes to speak to a doctor, and the doctor speaks with a London Cockney accent and doesn't feel as trusted. So the doctor's colleagues say, well, adopt a more RP because the patient's like that. It's not because you can't communicate well. It's because that's going to engender in them, and possibly unfair, but in the real, as it were, practical sense, it might be necessary to adopt a mode of speaking.
It's kind of an unquestioned, a correct way of AQA curricula. In the exam advice, for instance, from AQA, it uses this phrase standard English. But as linguists, we're not really sure what this is. There isn't one standard English. There's multiple standard Englishes. And often people use kind of a proxy of what they mean to be written standard English and apply that to spoken standard English. But our view, at least, is this is just an ideology, and that really all ways of speaking English should be appreciated and should be valued, because at the end of the day, they are English, right? And they should be recognized as such. So I think we've worked quite heavily on dismantling this notion that there is one such way of speaking that is correct. We don't believe that. We take a descriptive approach. We describe what's there rather than a prescriptive approach, which says you should speak in a certain way.
I was brought up in Crawley, Newtown, south of London, and so most of the people in the new town were from South London, and my parents were from London, but they were of that kind of educated working class that prized speaking properly. My parents would say, "You must speak properly, Jonathan. John, you must speak properly." And one day I said to them something like, "Oi, kiss it here. Oi, mum, kiss it." And she said, "Oh," to my dad, "Stan, listen to how he speaks." And I took this on board quite forcefully, that I was and they described it as a slovenly speaker.
Yeah, or so non-standard that they internalize these standard language ideologies, right? So rather than what we think they should, celebrate, we as speakers should celebrate the inherent diversity that's in language. Often people internalize the kind of ideologies that they are told at school, that they're told as children, and then they reflect those, either in the kids that they have or in the students that they teach. And so really we're trying to say, actually, what we should do is actually just embrace that diversity and recognize that oi is as good as hey. At least in my dialect, oi is perfectly acceptable, right?
Yes, yes. My mum would say, "Let your only you speaking badly, speaking lazily." So there was always, as you say, a deficiency. Somehow it was your own fault, and you needed to work
Yeah.
harder at speaking properly.
Yeah.
Things have gone.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going. Things have changed, haven't they? Though I mean, since I'm remembering the 1960s. So we,
Yeah.
now accents. In fact, isn't it true that some accents, regional accents in Britain, for instance, northern accents, Scottish accents for that matter, are considered almost more authoritative and trustworthy and so on than once the BBC standard RP would sound a bit old-fashioned and creaky now. But if I wanted to sell you insurance, I might well adopt a sort of
Yeah.
Edinburgh accent.
Yeah. So, things, the pronunciation, which many people think of as Queen's or King's English. And obviously now, if, for instance, you turn on the news in Newcastle, you probably will hear Newcastle based Geordie reading the news, right? So
Yes.
things have changed. Do I think there's still linguistic discrimination and accent bias? Absolutely. So, sure, we might have a greater representation of speakers now, but I think people are still quite unaware that this is an issue. And I mean, this issue is often in the news in relation to universities with students experiencing accent bias and linguistic discrimination. And it's often experienced in what we might think of as elite professions, where if you are asked to imagine the variety of English that a judge speaks, for instance, it's probably not like a very regionally marked variety, right? It's likely received pronunciation. But yeah, obviously on the flip side of that, you're right in terms of I remember a couple of years ago, actually this is probably quite a long time ago now, there was a broadband company called PlusNet who used a very strong Yorkshire speaker to do their advertisements. And part of that was because in market research, that particular variety of Yorkshire English was found to be quite friendly and welcoming. So, yeah, they are the thing with regionally marked dialects is they're often rated high in terms of friendliness and these kind of social evaluations, but in terms of prestige ratings, they're generally rated quite low. So in our research, we found that a minority ethnic, for instance, Indian English, or varieties associated with former industrial towns and cities like Birmingham are rated much lower in terms of their prestige. So there's something more complex going on than simply just an improvement. It's an improvement in a way, but not to the extent that I would like to see, where we simply just don't think of accent as a discriminatory factor.
You're listening to the Friday morning break on Teachers Talk Radio on the 29th of November. My guest this week is Dr. Christian Ilbery, and we are discussing accent, oracy, and the concept of speaking properly. Join us again after a word from our sponsor.
Parentkind are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour, and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out! Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading!
Hey educators, ready to kickstart 2025 with world-class inspiration? Then don't miss Bet UK, happening January 22nd to 24th in London. Get fired up in our high-energy arena hosted by Laura McInerney, with an incredible lineup. Hear from racing driver and inclusion advocate Nicholas Hamilton, and the poetic power duo Michael Rosen and Christian Foley. Plus, don't miss the legendary Stephen Fry discuss the human approach to AI. Explore hundreds of hours of unmissable content, the latest edtech, and free CPD opportunities to supercharge your skills. All for free, so why wait? Head to betshow.com and book your ticket now. Let's make 2025 your best year yet.
Now, before we took a short break there, Christian, you were talking about the way in which accent, for better or worse, carries certain connotations of social value, and we really wish that wasn't the case. And I remember when I taught this sort of thing in communication studies and sociology and such like, that one of the concepts which we taught students was the difference between elaborated codes and restricted codes. In other words, there were ways of speaking which were more efficient, ways of speaking that were more effective than others. And I think a lot of people will think of that as one of the most important and central features of speaking is its efficiency, its ability to, well, communicate well. Isn't that a consideration when you're trying to teach students how to speak?
Yeah, so I strongly reject the idea that it's the onus is on the speaker, right? Like changing like as linguists, we know that this is kind of installed at an early point in your life. And actually being able to be linguistically adept is really difficult. There is some variation that we don't have control over and we can't adapt. And so expecting a speaker to adapt their speech to the social conditions of whatever job or whatever is, in my view, completely the wrong way of going about it. I think instead we just need to raise up speakers so that we do hear people in those positions, right? I'm in this job as a lecturer in sociolinguistics at what is often framed as an elite university. And I think it's important that somebody who doesn't have an RP accent and sounds slightly non-standard is sometimes in these positions so that other speakers feel that they're validated. So my question is, I don't see why, for instance, why a Cockney speaker shouldn't be a doctor, right? There are, there are obviously people who grow up in Leighton who then go and train to become a doctor, and maybe they have a Cockney accent. And I think, should they keep that accent? Absolutely. That's part of their identity. And I think when you see these stories about people who felt that they had to shift to get where they are, you often see this really sad discourse of them feeling like they've lost part of their identity. So my view is we need to work on dismantling the system, not expecting speakers or individuals to shift, because it doesn't solve the problem. It's just a sticking plaster, right? They'll be discriminated against in other ways. It's clearly not just language.
That's it. That's interesting, because a lot of we're going to talk about oracy. I mean, oracy and literacy go together. Oracy is very much in a topic at the moment. There was a Guardian article recently about it. Ofsted have said schools must take oracy more important. And one of those parts of oracy, besides comprehension and ability to respond, is also the ability to sort of perform and make yourself understood, almost in a sort of rhetorical sense. You can you be a powerful, persuasive, and they'll talk in terms of using language in different ways, knowing your audience and adapting the way you speak. Am I talking to try and convey knowledge or instructions, or be persuasive or be entertaining? So that's a sort of adapting the way we speak, and we all do that, don't we? We sort of play with language in a way.
Yeah. So my worry is sometimes with discussions about oracy is that people conflate what we're talking about in relation to accent with speaking, in a certain style for a particular audience, right? And the two are separable, right? I can, in this variety of English, I can speak persuasively. I can use the discourse register of speaking persuasively. And so, at essence, my hope is for the potential focus on oracy, that people focus on what kind of discursive strategies, so actual discourse strategies, do you need to use to be a persuasive speaker, rather than, we need to focus on speaking a certain way to sound persuasive. These two are two different things. And for me, like a Cockney speaker, a speaker of like a Geordie, you can be persuasive in your regional dialect, whether you say like literally or literally is separable from like how persuasive your argument is. And so if oracy focuses on improving individuals, persuasive and argumentative skills, then focus on that, not on the linguistic information that is otherwise tangential to this issue.
Yes, I remember when I was a kid, we used to make fun of my father, who had what we called his telephone accent.
Oh,
So he would
yeah.
pick up the telephone, and suddenly his London accent had gone, and he was very much, 75925, Mr. Gibbs speaking, and so on. And there, I've got some old tapes of him recording at Christmas, and he'd say, and here it is in 1963, where you did not sound like that in normal voice. But he was to some extent changing his accent, but he was changing his diction, his cadence.
I mean, so we all, like you said earlier, we all do this. This is what linguists call style shifting. So, like, if I enter into an interview, I probably will use a more formal register. I will use perhaps more standard ways of speaking because they are associated with that particular context. And so, I study youth language on the whole. I'm interested in how young people speak. And if you get a young person in an interview, they're very linguistically aware, right? They're not going to speak like how they speak with their mates in an interview because they have a linguistic knowledge of what might be deemed, appropriate or effective in, the interactions amongst their peers versus when you interview them for a job. So I don't have much concern that this is really like an issue because we all do style shifting to some degree. My kind of concern is just more generally where people are evaluated against things that are out of their style range. So the things that they can't shift. And so like for many people saying water as water rather than water, that's their dialect, right? And so expecting someone to shift that, it might not be possible, or it might not be a worthwhile expectation.
And as you say, if even worse than that, in a sense, is if we hear someone say water or bath instead of bath or whatever, we then make a judgment completely erroneously that they therefore can't do this particular job, or they will project the wrong image of our company or whatever.
Exactly. So we have this long archetypal image of like what a should sound like, what a teacher should sound like, and anybody who deviates from that, where we question why, right? And often the question of why is, well, if they deviate from this language, perhaps they're not competent, perhaps they're not intelligent. And obviously, like you just said, none of these things are related to language, right? Like I have a PhD, I'm a lecturer at Russell Group University. I probably don't sound like, 10 other lecturers in the university, right? So the question is, why can't doctors sound like Cockney speakers if they're from a Cockney speaking area? And so I think we really need to disentangle things like intelligence, competence, professional attitude from things that actually do cue to language, like social identity.
I mentioned earlier, I proposed that things had changed since the 1960s. Clearly, they have to some extent. But is it possible that simply this is a slow process? And the fact that you're a professor at an elite university and high court judges are still largely drawn from the world of public schools, but as time goes by, and even public school accents themselves are changing, that in the future there'll be more women, there will be more people like me and you sitting on benches and being admirals and being doctors and so on. And that will just sort of over time become less of a thing.
Yes, that's the hope at least. I think we also schools or privilege, but equally that's quite complex too, because as you described earlier, lots of speakers of non-standard varieties, especially working class children, are told their language is deficient, and so they often feel they have to shift to RP, and then they're kind of caught in a double bind where now we're kind of trying to progress beyond simply hearing RP accents. But some RP speakers are from a working class background. They've just had to, drop their accent or whatever. So yeah, we are getting better. People are starting to listen to us, I think. People are interested in this topic. I think, one of the positives of the recent, interest more generally in people talking about discrimination and axes of discrimination is that language is starting to be considered in terms of these factors. Whereas, sociolinguists have been working on this since the 50s, the 60s. And I think there is now an appetite in public discourse to talk about this in a way that really chimes with quite a lot of people.
Yes.
My hope is, we're making progress.
Well, that is I'm so pleased that you're a guest on Teachers Talk Radio, because I think that the kind of research and things that sociolinguists are talking about and researching into, lots of the papers I've seen that you've written sound absolutely fascinating. Some years ago, I ran the debating society. The big thing at the moment is state schools should have debating societies. Well, I was at a state school. We had a debating society, and we went up against a private school, and they were much better. And they were much better because I thought, well, at the end of it, I thought our team, we won competitions and so on last year, but our state school kids simply didn't have the ability to almost perform their rhetoric in a weird sense. It's almost as if these kids were the same age, but they seemed so much more competent. And that's that thing, isn't it? Private school kids have that confidence and ability to deliver. Yeah. Should we be teaching that?
And half of that is we didn't get the same level of input, right, as privately educated students, where they would have had, for instance, explicit lessons in debating, in argumentation, in these things. And I think providing those kind of lessons for state school kids and for other kids outside of the private school system, that is beneficial, right? Because they will come to university, they will be asked to write an argumentative piece, and having those discursive skills to to argue your thoughts convincingly, that is a positive. Obviously, it's a positive. And I think my concern is sometimes when that is then conflated with how somebody's speaking, right? Yes. So our advice always is to focus on what speakers actually say, not how they say it. So if oracy is now going to be a thing, which clearly it is, it's in governmental policy, etc., then I think we just need to disentangle the stuff that I'm talking about related to linguistic discrimination and accent bias from, for instance, giving students actual skills to be able to articulate their ideas in a convincing, argumentative, descriptive way, which that seems to me to be fairly straightforward.
You are listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs here on Teachers Talk Radio. And it's the 29th of November, and my guest this week is Dr. Christian Ilbery from Edinburgh University. We are discussing oracy, language, accent, and education, of course. Join us again after a message from our sponsor and the Teachers Talk Radio news.
Parentkind are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour, and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out! Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading!
Hey educators, ready to kickstart 2025 with world-class inspiration? Then don't miss Bet UK, happening January 22nd to 24th in London. Get fired up in our high-energy arena hosted by Laura McInerney with an incredible lineup. Hear from racing driver and inclusion advocate Nicholas Hamilton and the poetic power duo Michael Rosen and Christian Foley. Plus, don't miss the legendary Stephen Fry discuss the human approach to AI. Explore hundreds of hours of unmissable content, the latest edtech, and free CPD opportunities to supercharge your skills. All for free, so why wait? Head to betshow.com and book your ticket now. Let's make 2025 your best year yet.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC Norfolk news website focuses on the national issue of school attendance. The report states that persistent absence from schools is higher in Norfolk than the national average. At secondary school level, the Norfolk total is at 38.1%, compared to the national average of 28.3%. And for primary schools, it is 18.9%, compared to 17.2%. The BBC sat in on hearings at magistrates' courts to hear the human stories behind the national issue. One parent told magistrates she was frightened of her son and had no control over him, whilst another said issues with the child using school toilets had led to school refusal. One family explained that their own ill health had affected their ability to take primary-age pupils to school, and restrictive shift patterns at work had made it even more difficult. Representatives from the local authority made comments after the hearings, reminding of the importance of ensuring a child's attendance to school, and it's as high as possible, as many times as possible. It pointed to government guidance which schools must follow to ensure regular attendance, with a focus on support to remove barriers to attendance overall. According to the TES magazine, private schools lose their GCSE results edge after adjustments for students' backgrounds. Researchers say state school students perform better in English, maths and science, but private schools still perform better in creative arts subjects. Researchers from UCL say the findings could have implications for parents deciding on the best education for their child, and raise questions about the relative strength of creative education in state schools. The analysis is based on GCSE results from state and independent schools from the 2016-17 cohort. The data from the UK Millennium Cohort study follows the lives of 19,000 young people born across all 4 home nations in 2000 to 2002. Before adjusting, private school students achieved 4/5 of a grade higher across all GCSE subjects, assuming 8 were studied. Once socioeconomic status was accounted for, the researchers said this difference was statistically indistinguishable from zero. But when just the core subjects were considered, state schools had the edge, achieving on average 2/3 of a grade higher in maths, 2/5 of a grade higher in science, and a slight advantage in English after all of the adjustments. Professor Jake Anders said it has been long assumed that the private sector outperforms the state, and that over the past 2 decades, state schools have increased their focus on core subjects. Full details can be found in the TES magazine online. Schools Week covers a story on school leader stress after Education Support released its annual Teacher Wellbeing Index. Although it reported that the overall wellbeing score of teachers and leaders had improved slightly, Chief Executive Sinead McBratey warned disturbingly high rates of stress, anxiety and burnout continue to affect staff, exacerbated by pupil and parent behaviours and a lack of support outside of school for children and young people. The article lists 7 issues, with 78% of teachers reported as being stressed, although there was a drop from 39% to 35% in staff reporting a mental health issue. On a positive note, the proportion of staff who said they considered their organisation's culture had a negative effect on their well-being fell from 55% to 50%, and 27% of staff now experience a culture which is positive for their well-being, up from 22% last year. Full details can be found in Schools Week on their online article. The Guardian covers claims that schools and colleges in England are failing in their legal duty to prevent and address racism. Campaigners are calling for the national curriculum in England to include an explicit anti-racism focus, with Black history as a compulsory subject. In a letter to the Prime Minister, a group of leaders from several organisations have warned that racism is holding all young people back and calls for urgent action to address the impacts of a growing crisis. The letter goes on to say that the planned review of the national curriculum offers a perfect opportunity to embed diverse anti-racist content. Recommendations in the letter include ensuring a whole school approach to tackling racism be implemented, the DfE to treat racism as a safeguarding issue, and for anti-racism guidance to be published for all schools and colleges. The organisations signing up to the letter include the Diana Award, Everyday Racism, and the African Caribbean Education Network, among others. A Department for Education spokesperson said, "Racism and discrimination have absolutely no place in our schools, and we have launched an independent curriculum and assessment review aimed at delivering a curriculum that reflects the diversities of our society." Finally, several parts of the UK were affected by the weather in recent days. More than 100 schools across the Scottish Highlands, 30 in North Wales, and almost 200 in Devon and Cornwall shut due to snow. Many schools affected, however, were able to continue teaching pupils, as online learning, developed during the pandemic, was activated for the majority of pupils. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
And that was the Teachers Talk Radio News, read and compiled by the wonderful Joe Fox. We're back on November the 29th here on Teachers Talk Radio with the Friday morning break. My guest this week, Dr. Christian Ilbery from Edinburgh University. We're discussing language, accent and oracy in schools. Now, Christian, I was wondering, when you conduct your research among students at Edinburgh University or elsewhere, how do you find that their actual experience when they go into higher education? There was a story in the press recently. I think Oxford University asked their private school students not to be snobs. I think the headline is something like that. Don't be snobs to your state school students. Yes. And I mean, is there a clash? My daughter, my younger daughter, went to Cambridge, and I thought a bit worried about this actually. What do you went to a state school, you're going to Cambridge. Is this going to be a problem? She didn't find it was a problem. Actually. How do you students find their experience in your research of the way they talk?
So I've been working with the student society in the interests of state school educated kids at the university, students, I don't know why I'm calling them kids. Quite a lot of evidence to suggest that linguistic discrimination, accent bias is a thing in the classroom. So not just amongst their peers, but also from lecturers, right? And I think that's really problematic. And it's something we've been trying to address. So I've been introducing explicit training on accent bias and linguistic discrimination. In another role, I'm the Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion for our school. So I've been introducing this as staff training. And I think it is an experience that a lot of students have, sure, both in terms of like working class students, but also students from Scotland too, where they experience sometimes anti-Scottish sentiment from some English students. So I think it is a pervasive issue. I actually am giving a talk in 2 weeks about how linguists often talk about this as a real world problem, but it's in our backyard. And I think if we really want to dismantle linguistic oppression and discrimination, we should start with our own patch, right? Like it isn't just in secondary schools, it isn't just in primary schools, it's being circulated, maintained at universities.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's such a difficult thing to disentangle because we're all full of prejudices and stereotypes. Not the way people look. I mean, there was that famous thing about the Kennedy-Nixon debate where people that watched it thought one person had won, people that heard it thought another person won. So the way you look, the way you perform, and your accent is going to be mixed up with all sorts of ideas about how people should look and sound when they speak. And so if a student is delivering in a seminar, and they have a certain accent and they look and sound in a certain way as well. I mean, sorry, they look and perform in a certain way. Then that's going to, how does the lecturer then, or the teacher maybe, disconnect from that and stand outside that and sort of reflect upon it.
Bias is a human universal tendency. It's something that we use to make sense of a very complex world. And so acknowledging that bias is a thing is fine, but you need to keep those biases in check, right? We all have biases. But I think it becomes really problematic when people use them to determine somebody's competence or somebody's, these kind of things that are really not related to how somebody looks or how somebody sounds. So keeping those biases in check, I think, is healthy for people.
You mentioned a little bit before, I think some of your research has looked at gender. And one of the features of attitude of teaching and how we respond to students, I remember looking at being told to look for this, in a sense that there's a tendency for boys to dominate conversation, for boys to use certain forms of language, technical jargon that will be then assumed to be greater knowledge than other forms of communication that girls might favor, which may be personal experiences and so on, that will be judged as parochial and kind of not particularly expert.
So, I think a lot that are assumed to be used by a particular gender. So the obvious one is high-rise, what we call high-rising terminals, or in the world people refer to as uptalk. So it's using a question intonation on a declarative statement. So you say something like, and I went to this party. So it's that final rise, where usually in English you would expect falling intonation. And people often hear this and they associate it, one, with women, and two, they associate it with the speaker not really knowing what they're talking about. It's a popular discourse. It's often spoken about as uncertainty. But in social linguistics, we've shown that actually it does something really, really useful in a conversation. It basically verifies whether the person you're speaking to has understood what you've just said. So it does something very useful in the discourse. And so I think as lay people, we often hear things, we see things, and we make a direct mapping between an identity and possibly a lay understanding of language. But when you speak to a social linguist, we're not the most fun at parties because we complicate, even the most straightforward idea about language. And we say, well, actually, it's not uncertainty. There's something else going on there that is actually quite useful. So when you recognize that actually the functions of language variation is actually much more complex than simply X, you recognize that people do very nuanced things with language.
So the rising intonation is someone saying, do you understand, kind of thing, as opposed to, I'm not sure I know what I'm talking about, which is, and you read different things.
Research on this shows that one, it's actually used heavily by men, and two, so not just women, and two, it does have this kind of verifying function, especially when you present new information in the discourse. So if I just told you something that you don't know about, it potentially does this kind of questioning. Well, perhaps because it's related to the question intonation, it does this kind of verification of what I've just said. So that's a useful function, not an inhibiting function. Similar thing with what people think of as disfluency markers. So people saying, all of these features which people consider to be the speaker not knowing what they're talking about, actually they're speech planning processes, right? It would be weird for people to just speak without them. And when we studied them, we show that actually they occur in really systematic ways. They show that a speaker is planning what they're going to say next. And these are what people hear of as speech disfluency, but we call fillers, often fulfill a particular linguistic function.
That's it. That's so fascinating. One of the kind of a young person's guru, Jordan Peterson, particularly one of the messages he, in his various books about 7 things to do and turn your life around, or whatever they're called, he said to young men, get rid of those. He says, speak clearly, speak without hesitation, get rid of the you knows and kindness and likes and you get me and anything like that. Rid your language of that is a sort of empowering means by which young men can show their confidence in the world.
I mean, if you listen to someone with manipulated speech where you've removed disfluency markers and discourse markers, it sounds ridiculous, right? So like we use these features for interesting and for systematic reasons. So I think if you manage somehow to remove all of these features, which I don't think anyone has ever been able to do, you will sound a bit like a robot.
Yes, it does sound AI. Yes, well, that's unfortunately that's probably going to be tested over the next few decades as non-human speakers will rival us in some ways for jobs. I don't know. So if we were saying what is the role of the teacher in teaching students in a world where prejudice exists, where we have certain unfair attitudes to language, and you say to a teacher, well, if you could be like Jodie Comer, the actress, and you can do every accent under the sun, or you can be, you say it's unfair, hold on to your original language, drop back to being a Liverpudlian wherever you want to, but be adaptive, play the game, sound a certain way. That would be poor advice you're suggesting.
I mean, so my advice is to embrace your linguistic identity, right? So you should change the way that you speak. I'm not one of those people. I think you should recognize that your linguistic identity is part of your identity, and that often expectations about shifting, about changing the way that you speak are classist, are racist, are homophobic in nature. So my advice is, well, to push back, right? And so we wouldn't accept people making explicit comments about somebody's social or racial background. And I don't understand why we accept it in terms of language, right? And I think it is because there is this misconception that it's very easy for people to change their language. It's not, right? Like there are people who go through quite a lot of trauma to sound different or to use a different variety, and then in the end don't really master it anyway, and so are judged against a native speaker standard or a standard that they can't obtain. So I think rather than just putting individuals through that traumatic process, I think we should say, well, why not? Why can't we just have like a Liverpudlian Cockney or what doctor, whatever? Like, I mean,
yes.
Like if you look at MPs in cabinet right now, like for instance, Angela Rayner, well, she sounds like her constituents, right? Like, surely that's a positive thing. She grew up in that area and she sounds like she's from that area. And would we want her to change and sound different? Probably not. She would probably then be ostracized by her constituents. So I think it's a positive thing to sound the way that you do.
Yes. Another area of your research I've noticed that is into the way in which language might be changed, adapted, developed by social media, things like TikTok and so on, and YouTube. Is there a language? Well, it's more, it's a kind of cliche, isn't it? That I don't understand young people today. They speak in their own language. Yeah. Is there a developing youth kind of language that teachers should be more accepting of, more aware of, or more encouraging of?
Okay, so to give you an example, I did some field work in East London. 2 years I worked with a youth group where the young people talk about their experiences of linguistic discrimination and bias at school. And there's this one extract of this individual talking about how someone in his class stepped on his crepes. Like crepes being like London Lexis or slang, what people call slang for trainers. And now it's pretty much spread across the UK. So people use it everywhere, right? And he said like the teacher is trying to get them ready to leave the room. And this guy steps on his crepes. So he says, "Miss, he stepped on my crepes." And the teacher clearly doesn't know what that word means. And she thinks it's something offensive, and it transpires that they have this back and forth, and then in the end she ends up putting him in detention. So he's reprimanded for using this word that she assumed straight away, because she doesn't understand it, is offensive. So do I think that teachers should probably have a better awareness of the linguistic dexterity of young people? Yes. I probably believe very strongly that a young person should not be put in detention or be reprimanded for using a word that is completely innocuous, whether you call it trainers or crepes. And there's obviously, all these self-help TikTok things online where it's like, what is the language that your young person is using, and is it something to be concerned about? And should we, censor the language? And I think it's a healthy activity for people who educate young people to know about their language, because most of it, 99% of it, is completely innocuous. And have young people always used different language from older people? Yes. Like, it would be weird if a 15-year-old spoke in the same way as a 45-year-old,
Yes.
right? We know since the beginning of time that young people distinguish themselves from their peers, their older and younger peers, by using language in innovative ways. So is this something new? Is it social media? Absolutely not. Is social media leading to new ways of speaking and interacting? That's a very complex question.
Yeah.
But what we can say is, I think young people should be respected for using the language that they do.
Yeah, and teachers, beware of trying to use the language of young people in order.
Yeah.
Beware. One feature of language use, it's more to do now away from oracy and get onto literacy, is that teachers will say students don't read books and so on. They don't write long form essays. They don't like to do that because they now communicate in a shorter, more compacted means of communication, because that suits the technology. In other words, is there a sort of technological determinism here that we are speaking the way the medium wants us to speak?
As a researcher, and some other generations didn't really read much when I was a child because I didn't enjoy it. And I remember my mum raised this as an issue with like my English teacher. And my English teacher said, well, he must read something. And she was like, well, yeah, I'll tell you, he'll come to shops and he'll read out like all the signs and everything. And she was like, well, he's reading. And yeah, right. Like, I think that's absolutely fine. Like, as long as we're like engaging with literature in a way. And, I think young people engage with more diverse forms of literature than some previous generations, and that's fine. Perhaps, I don't really know the statistics in terms of like young people reading books or reading more short form styles of literature, and whether that is related to technology. My view is if people are engaging with language, and that is a benefit to society, full stop.
Yeah, so it's that argument. I remember my parents took a very dim view of the Beano and comics, which they did not consider to be proper reading at all.
What is proper reading? I think that's my question. Is, like I said, I was not a typical reader, and here I am now reading for a job.
And of course, you again, it's ability to read different things in different circumstances and for different reasons. And then most English teachers would accept that, I'm sure now. But there's still a degree of hesitation about illustrated novels. I've forgotten what they're called now.
Sure.
And so forth. And, comic type. Possibly where I was going with the idea of the sort of what they sometimes call the TikTok generation. TikTok comes in for a lot of harsh comments.
Yeah.
The TikTok generation is that it because of its brevity, it encourages a kind of thinking brevity, in the sense that if everything has to be compiled into short gobbets of knowledge, then that's the way you'll see the world and think about the world.
And stuff like this. So it's like whatever new technology is there, people assume it determines social and linguistic practice in a way that is completely new. But if you contextualize these discourses, they are persistent, right? Like they're exactly the same. And like you can go through history and you see similar discourses about other technologies, right? There are similar technologies in the history of English about there are similar discourses of books, right? When books first became a thing, people were worried that they would lead to the downfall of the English language. So it's perhaps unsurprising that now, we're holding books up as this very positive technology, and we're saying, well, it's now social media that's destroying language. And I think that really is just indicative of this over-determination, this assumption that technology does something really radical, when actually lots of the things that we see on TikTok are the same as what we saw on YouTube, maybe even Instagram, on technologies prior to TikTok itself. I think it's really, it's an interesting platform, but it's not crazy. It's not that dramatic.
Yes, there's a bit of moral panic, isn't there? And every new technology is going to come along,
Yeah,
where young people will stop reading or become more violent or something.
yeah, exactly that.
One of the things you wrote, I don't know how I can segue this into being about schools, but I just got a fascinating title, and it seems to me
Sure.
it leads into kind of identity creation and language and so on.
Uh,
Was digital commodification of white woman style. And I thought,
yeah,
well, we're talking here about something, as far as I understand, only read the abstract. I've got
sure.
to admit that. And it seems to me suggesting something about the way in which the presentation of language does link to a presentation of certain types of persona, which might be also useful for the marketing things. We might call a kind of the Cardassianization of language. It presents a certain image. Is there
Yeah,
I don't know quite where I finished that thought entirely, but it's a fascinating piece of
sure.
work.
Thanks. So yeah, I mean, so language clearly does something than just simply index or point to social identities. It can be used in a way that's like strategic. So often people, and this is why I'm interested in that paper, often people will use a language that is not their own or is perceived to be marked as not their own. So, when I'm telling a story about, for instance, my dad, I will often put on his voice, right? So I'll put on like a more masculine or like, cockney sounding voice. And so you can hear that people do this kind of language play all the time. And in that paper, I'm interested in how an online community use features of what we have in the UK as like this stereotyped white working class woman's voice that people often associate with popular figures like Gemma Collins and so on, and how they write in that style and why they write in that style. Because if you look at a lot of social media discourse, it's often written in a way that like looks like this style, even though that user is a man and is perhaps not even from the UK at all. So my question in that paper is like, why do people do this? It's really interesting when you drill down into why people do it. And like, obviously they do it to generate humor, but there's something much more complex going on about people stylizing language in this way. Because it tells us something about like class dynamics, like sure, they're parodying the voice of this white working class woman, but they also think she lives in a certain way, like she has crushed velvet cushions, her house is decorated in silver, like she shops in B&M and goes on holiday to Zante with the girls and stuff like this. So like it cottons on to like these ideas about social class in the UK that are like deeply embedded and that no one explicitly ever tells you. But we all know this person, right? Like whether it exists or not, we all know the kind of woman that it's targeting. So that's what that paper looks at. And it's something that I'm really interested in. It's like, why do people, speak or use language in ways that doesn't look like their own?
Yes, it is. And it's almost as if the particularly working class accents and ways of speaking are continually being wrong-footed. As soon as they alter, then that's a new form of failing. You're now a chav, or you're now, well, it's always this.
We used to describe working class communities. We have loads, right? But we don't have many for upper class speakers, right? I mean, snob, and that's probably about it, right? Whereas you can think of like very granular, like Ned in Scotland, like Chav here in the UK more generally. You have The Hun, which is the paper that I wrote about white working class women.
Yeah.
So there's lots of discourses that essentially regulate working class speakers.
Yes, fascinating. We've come to an end. Wonderful discussions. Thank you so much. And I'll end on one question. Where is your research taking you now? What sort of things will you be looking at and following up this direction of language?
So coming in February, I'm just publishing a book, a student guide on digital communication, and that kind of sums up my thinking about what I just said. And then I've also been working quite heavily on bringing accent bias and linguistic discrimination training into the university guidance. So that's something that I'm going to be working on over the course of the next few years.
Well, thank you so much. It's given us a lot to think about. And then any teachers listening on Friday morning or on the podcast, more likely, Dr. Christian Ilbery, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me.
And that brings to an end another episode of the Friday Morning Break here on Teachers Talk Radio on the 29th of November, as the weekend is nearly upon us and Christmas not far behind. We've been listening this week to a discussion between myself and Dr. Christian Ilbery from Edinburgh University. And we've been discussing oracy and language and accent, and in particular accent and the way we make judgments about the value of people's accents and make judgments about people and their identity via their accents. If you'd like to hear this episode again, you can hear it on, of course, the archive on the Teachers Talk Radio site or Spotify or multiple other platforms. Please listen again in 2 weeks' time as I continue to explore what schools are for and the purpose of education in general. Nothing like being ambitious. See you again.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.